Hello, nonprofit friends. Welcome back. We have another episode of a Modern Nonprofit podcast. And today we're going to talk about something we haven't talked about before. And I'm really excited to talk about it because I've struggled with this in my own, right, in my own business, my own image, my own brand. We're going to talk about personal branding. We're going to talk about personal branding as a nonprofit leader. And I don't know all this. I'm not an expert in this space. I've dabbled with it a little bit on my own, which is why I bring along my new friend, as I do every week, Seth Donlin. Seth, you are a marketing communications coach and you work a lot on storytelling and strategic branding for-profit, nonprofit businesses. You have tons and tons of years of experience and you work with people and organizations on a macro and a micro level. But today we're going to kind of zoom in and we're going to talk specifically about personal branding, why that's important, and maybe even a little controversial in the nonprofit world specifically. So before we dive into all of my interrogation and questions and curiosities, first and foremost, of course, I want to say thank you for taking time out on your lovely Friday morning to record this episode with me and to share a little bit more about your insight and experience in this topic. So, Seth, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tasha. I'm flattered to be here and excited to be here. And, I think it's going to be a really great discussion. And so I encourage all the listeners, make sure you stay to the end. We're going to be talking about a lot of great stuff. And if you do stay to the end, I've got something really cool that I'm going to offer up to the audience, but you got to be here at the end to get it. So stick with us.
Stay to the end, stay to the end. So let's just kind of dive right in and I'll set the groundwork. So when we talk about personal branding, it's really kind of, I think, elevating or differentiating in my mind the image of individual leaders within a nonprofit. And Seth, admittedly, in all of my years of experience working in and around the nonprofit space, I think it's pretty safe to say that a lot of people kind of shy away from positioning themselves as kind of an individual separate from the nonprofit world, because whether you are a fundraiser or a leader of a nonprofit in any capacity, but I especially hear this in the fundraising capacity, that you want donors or those that support or know and love your cause to be connected to the cause and not the individual. And I know, Seth, you and I kind of got to talking and it spurred an idea in my mind, but like we're not robots, we're humans after all. And we're in a very human centric industry, right? And people that are giving, yes, they give to a cause that they're very passionate about, but at the end of the day, it's that human connection oftentimes that motivates people to give. And I personally experienced this kind of in my own way. If I really, really like a person, even though I really love the mission, but I really like the person and I really love their energy and passion for the cause that we have in common, I'm going to be more likely to give and give more than I would if perhaps maybe I didn't have a connection with that person, right? It's much easier to give someone that you like and you respect than to somebody you don't, which really kind of brings up this whole conversation then, like, why should nonprofits in your mindset invest in building their personal brand? Like, why should they have an identity that is separate but very much related to the nonprofit? Why should they be an individual and not just like we the people of the organization? Why is this important?
Well, yeah, I think I mean, I don't think, I know that it's important for a number of reasons.
Mhm.
And, I'll touch very quickly on one that maybe you wouldn't be expecting us to say. But look, people that are working in nonprofits, uh, they're making their career in nonprofits just like anybody else. This is their
Mhm.
job, this is their career. They want to be successful in their career, and they
Mhm.
deserve to be recognized for the
Mm.
success that they have in their career. And look, hopefully people are going to grow with the nonprofit that they're working with, but we all know that people are eventually going to change. Unlikely that you hire somebody out of college and then they retire at the age of 65 or something
Mhm.
in the same
Mhm.
nonprofit, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, in from the sense of a selfish standpoint, people should be branding themselves as the competent, strong, successful professionals that they are, because
Mhm.
the nonprofit profession is a profession. All right.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
to that aside, though,
Yeah.
in terms of the organization, right? If you're in the nonprofit world, like you were saying, the focus is going to be on the nonprofit. The focus is on the mission. We're doing this not because of ourselves. We're doing this because of the people that we're looking to help, the community that we're serving, and so on, so forth.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean that people don't have the same kind of reaction to individuals that they do in a for-profit setting, right? They
Mhm.
say people don't buy from organizations, from companies, people buy from people. People don't
Right.
do business with companies, people do business with people. And
Mm-hmm.
that is still true to a certain extent in the nonprofit world. And if
Mm-hmm.
if you think about it, maybe even in just the simplest term, if you're planning a gala and you're trying to get people to come to the gala, and part of what you're going to do when they come to your gala is you're going to have your staff there and they're going to be out there chatting up the people that have come to try to, you know, make sure that next year they're going to give maybe at a slightly higher level or that they're going to stay on to thank them for coming out and supporting the gala, all the things that you're going to be doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if these people are, if your donors are making a decision, am I going to give not only my time, but my money to this gala and
Mm-hmm.
show up? Are they more likely to show up to this gala if they really don't have any human connection to any of the staff? Or are
Mm-hmm.
they likely to show up, more likely to show up to the gala if they have gotten to know via whatever, LinkedIn and
Mm-hmm.
Instagram and
Mm-hmm.
podcasts and other things, if they've started to build a real personal human connection with the staff members, not just the executive director or whatever, but across, throughout the depth of the staff, they've started to make connections with these people. They've
Mm-hmm.
started to know them. And because they know them, I mean, this is the way the brain works, right? The more you know something, unless you're finding out something negative about it, your brain trusts somebody that you're more familiar with and know. All right. So if you
Mm-hmm.
know and you trust that person, when you trust the brain, the next step is the brain automatically likes. Right. So
Sure.
now if you know, like, and trust these people and they're inviting you to the party, and now you're thinking, oh, well, yeah, I want to show up because I want to see, you know, Abe and Joan and Tom because I like them. I've enjoyed my interactions with them. I think I'm going to have a fun
Mm-hmm.
time with them, right? That's a very simple and one specific instance, but it spills over into all aspects of
Mm-hmm.
your organization. If you're trying to recruit volunteers and then the volunteers are thinking, oh, well, I'm going to get to see these people that I've gotten to
Yeah.
know, like, and trust, right? I mean, again, it's across the board. And if you're putting out, um, you know, calls for help, financial help, right?
Right.
Wherever you're putting them, people are going to have the opportunity, email, video on social media platforms, whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
You're fighting for limited attention of right of your potential donors or your current donors. And are they more likely to watch the full video if they've gotten to really kind of know you and like you? They understand
Mm-hmm.
you on a more personal
Mm-hmm.
level, of course, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the more that you can get your staff as real human faces of your organization, and not just for the work that they do in your organization, but like I would advise somebody who's doing, personal branding for their for-profit business, for their
Mm-hmm.
career or something. You want people to know about a little bit about your home life. You don't have to give away private secrets, but if you've
Right.
got dogs, if you've got cats, if you have children, whatever the
Sure.
case may be, that humanizes you and gets people feeling that they know you a little bit more.
Yeah, I feel like the concept of personal branding is something that I've been paying a little bit more attention to, maybe because it's talked about more, it's becoming more and more a thing. But I think it's really interesting you bring up a point of, nonprofit leaders for their own personal reasons why they want to build a brand. To your point, they're professionals, they're maybe rising stars in that community, and they're likely committed to that industry or certain segments of that industry during their career. And so it brings up an interesting point that I think a statistic that I find pretty staggering, that the nonprofit sector has the highest turnover than any other industry in the labor market. So, it's pretty safe to assume that you will probably be moving into a different role or a different organization, certainly many times in your career, which kind of speaks to the importance of the personal branding even more. And I want to talk about some more of the specific elements of what an effective personal brand is for a nonprofit leader. So, what are some of those key things that you think of first and foremost with just the key elements of personal branding? What would those be if someone's not familiar with this concept?
Yeah, well, clearly probably first and foremost, you want to be able to to tie yourself to the mission that you
Mm,
are involved in, right?
mm, mm-hmm.
Um, you know, it's great if you are, an operations person and like, you can really sing the song about, excuse me, about how amazing you are at operations. But in the
Mm-hmm.
nonprofit world, right, you want to be able to say, you're not just some hired gun that was brought in to do operations because you're the
Right.
best at it, but that you,
Right.
but you're choosing to do it right because you feel the call of the mission,
Sure.
because then other people are going to say, oh, okay, everybody at that organization really feels it, and they, I feel it too, and I want to give, right, or I want to support
Mm-hmm.
them with gifts in kind or volunteer hours or whatever the case may be.
Sure.
um, so first of all, you want to tie yourself to the mission. You also want to tie yourself to the organization, the other people that you're working with, right?
Mm,
Because it's, lots of for-profit organizations, particularly big for-profit, big companies. You talk about their wonderful work culture and it's a family or what, blah, blah, blah. And in some
mm.
cases, maybe that's true. In others,
Mm-hmm.
probably it's maybe
Mm,
not so.
yeah.
But, in a lot of nonprofits, again, maybe not all, but in a lot of nonprofits, that's very true, right? It tends to be smaller organizations, tight knit people, again, are there for a, a shared goal, a shared passion that
Mm,
they're feeling, and they
mm-hmm.
work closely together. They're, maybe they're a little happier putting in the longer hours because it's not just a paycheck. And so I think it helps to tie yourself not only to just the overall mission in the organization, but the people that you're working with. And
Sure.
then, of course, tying yourself to the people um, that you're serving, the community
Right.
that you're serving. And there's all kinds of different ways to do this. Um, you know, when you're building your brand, I would say those are the things that you want to focus on in terms of your work.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to personal branding, then you also want to be giving of yourself a little bit, right? You want to
Mm-hmm.
be, it's personal branding, so you want to be personal. And I want to make, a point that a lot of people get nervous about in a business setting being personal. And
Mm,
so I want to make the difference between personal and private, right? So
mm,
I have a
mm-hmm.
daughter. I'm married. These are personal details. I'm not hiding those things, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't consider them particularly private, right? Now, I'm probably not going to tell you the address of the grade school that my daughter goes to, that
Right.
right out, like I'm talking
Right.
to hundreds of people here or maybe thousands of people.
Right.
No, I'm not. That's private. I'm not going to talk about that, right?
Right.
if if I've gone through some trauma in my life and it's very recent and I'm still processing it,
Mm-hmm.
thankfully my wife and I are happily married for coming up on 20 years, but maybe I've been through a divorce very recently, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's personal and probably at this point private, right?
Right.
I haven't finished processing and I'm still going through the grief of it or the turmoil or
Mm-hmm.
whatever the case may be. Now,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm like a year or two or whatever, 3 years removed from it, and I've processed it, I've come out the other end, and I'm saying, oh, that was actually a good thing for me, or it was really rough, but
Mm-hmm.
now I've healed from it and I've learned
Sure.
lessons from it. Well, now this is something great for you to talk about. It's your choice, but it can become
Right.
a personal thing and no longer a private thing because it's not raw, it's not intensely emotional for you at the moment, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you have to make those decisions when you're dealing with personal branding of what in your life is personal and then what in your life is private. And those two things they're not the same, right? There
Sure.
can be a little bit
Yeah.
of an overlap, maybe where you're uncertain. And if you're uncertain, don't talk about it.
Right.
But there's some things that are personal that you can talk about. And that doesn't mean you have to let everybody up in your business and talk about everything that's going on in your life.
Mm-hmm.
That's not effective personal branding. That's, you know, having no filter and having no
Yeah.
limits and dumping things on people.
Exactly. And I've seen this, I think, come up, and I find it really interesting to follow leaders of businesses. And I think everybody kind of has some natural curiosity, right? Of like leaders of businesses, whether it's for profit, nonprofit, government, whatever it might be, where they speak a lot about their work, but they have a personal flair on it. And I really find that as a journey, a story, kind of someone's like behind the scenes a little bit. And I find that really fascinating. I think a lot of people do. I mean, maybe that's why we have reality TV and X and like all these things, Instagram is so popular and TikTok and whatever now. Um, People love that and they love that story. And I think where that's different in the nonprofit world, I have seen is that this idea that it's about the mission, it's about the organization, it's not about one individual person. It's this, I don't know, dare I even say like martyrdom, or like we can't take a lot of credit or acknowledgement for the work that's being done. It has to be, all the attention has to be on the organization. But the thing is, as much as we might have macro level organizational wide like communication plans and media that's going out, and maybe a periodic newsletter that people are following into, nothing really can replace that kind of personal connection with people. And admittedly, for anybody listening that's a leader of a nonprofit that's feeling maybe a little convicted by this conversation, like should I do that, should I not do that, I think it really resonates with people and it connects you with people in a different way that might be those that might be shying away from seeking services that you all offer. It might be funders that might want to support you. It might be colleagues that can collaborate with you. And Seth, I know I've kind of struggled with this too, because it's like, I started this accounting firm 9 years ago now. And originally I'm like, yeah, I am one person. I never intended on having a big firm. Now we have over 50 employees, right? And there was definitely a shift of like, do I need to fall back and kind of shy away from being like the face of the organization, because it's not all about me. And I don't want people to think it's about me, or I'm trying to make it about me, or I'm trying to make it less and less about me. Honestly, there's only so much of me, right? But how do I continue to elevate the other people that are helping support this, right? Because I think maybe, especially in the nonprofit world, we want to give credit where credit's due. And we know that even though we might be the cheap whatever, there's certainly, we couldn't do the work without the support of everyone that works with us, right? And I think that that's a little bit of a conviction and a struggle I have on like what is appropriate, what is not, like how do I elevate other people? Should I be so like forward? Should I be so vocal? Should I be out there as much? And striking that balance. And then honestly, just finding the time to do it. But so that's why I love having this conversation. And it doesn't have to be this whole like intentional campaign. It can be a little more organic, like you're saying, sharing your experiences or personal ties with the mission, or some examples of some of the work that you're doing, or maybe interactions that you've had with program participants. Of course, you can, be private about that as well, and keep it anonymous, but just kind of sharing some of your experiences going through this work, and lessons that you're learning along your leadership journey, I think really makes you more relatable, more interesting, and therefore
Mhm.
forces people to pay more attention to the work that you're doing. Like this person's kind of interesting. If they're interested in this cause, then maybe I should be taking a second look at it. That might be something that I'm also interested in.
You use the word relatable, and I think it's so hugely important in personal branding. I think important in branding in general, but certainly
Hmm.
in personal branding. We hear a lot of people talk about authenticity, and I'm not knocking that. I talk about authenticity a lot, but I think a lot of times what gets missed is the next step. I say things need to be authentic and they need to be relatable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that you can't have a story that's outside the norm. If your story is that you were like an incredible Olympian who won more medals than anybody else, or just won, an
Hmm.
impressive amount of medals, or even one, right? I have no
Yeah.
Olympic medals, so one medal would be pretty great, I
Hmm.
think. But if you have this huge story, it's not that you can't tell that huge story, right? Those are good stories too. But I think a
Hmm.
lot of times when we start thinking about telling stories in the sense of business and nonprofit as a business, um, we go to the bookstore and we see all these books about somebody that like was in the Olympics or led the SEALs, all of the Navy SEALs in Afghanistan, or
Right.
climbed Everest and fell off and had to cut their leg off and crawl
Mm.
back and
Right.
saved 8 children along the way or whatever, right? And this is this amazing book.
Yeah.
And you're like,
You're
oh my
like,
God. And then they teach you
hmm.
how to market your business better based upon
Right.
what they learned falling off of Everest or something. Well, I mean, there's a lot of value in that. These books become bestsellers,
Sure.
for a reason,
Mhm.
right? But those are totally unrelatable stories,
Right.
right?
Right.
And if you limit yourself to this idea that I can only tell a story if I was a, Major League Baseball all-star 10 years in a row, and here are the lessons that I learned during my career or something, well, then there's almost nobody can tell stories, right?
Hmm.
But if you tell the story about the interaction that you had picking up your kid at school and how it made you think about unexamined privilege or miscommunication, or
Right.
whatever the epiphany that you had during this everyday experience that you had,
Hmm.
those stories are incredibly relatable because we've all had, right? We all go to the
Yeah.
grocery store, the dry cleaners. We all, not everybody has children, but you know what I mean? We all have
Sure.
children. We all, or were children, right? We all have these experiences, and those become very powerful because, again, it's the way the mind works, mirror neurons, right? When we can very easily see ourselves in the other person, the emotional connection ratchets up. When the
Mhm.
emotional connection ratchets up, we pay more attention, we code memories into our brains
Right.
more deeply and more effectively, right?
Hmm.
It has all of these great spillover effects. And so having those relatable, talking about those things that are relatable, your dog, your children, your conversation that you had with aging parents, or
Hmm. Hmm.
or the conversation, if you're younger, the conversation that you had when you were finally realizing, and your parents were finally realizing you're adult and they're adults and
Hmm.
your dynamic has changed, whatever. We all have these things in our life,
Sure.
right? Those are the things that we should really be looking to mine for our storytelling in terms of branding ourselves. But I would argue, in connecting with our donors, volunteers, whatever, the people that are key, the various groups that are key to your nonprofit, because again, that's going to make you relatable. It's going to make you more understandable, more likable,
Hmm.
more easily trusted. And those are going to, the downstream effects of that is going to be better engagement, higher donations, more support from local politicians or community leaders, whatever it is, whoever it is that you're
Hmm.
engaging with at that time.
So as I'm hearing you talk, I'm thinking about um, marketing and selling and branding and development, like all of these things, for profit, nonprofit, it doesn't matter. This is a big area that I think people underestimate how much is their responsibility in a leadership role and how important it is, and how they may be very uncomfortable with it. Again, this is something I personally kind of gone back and forth on. And this is similar to a topic I think that people that get into leadership positions within a nonprofit organization, a lot of times they kind of come up through the programmatic side of things. So I kind of use the example, especially in like health focused organizations, that you might be like a nurse and somehow you end up finding yourself running a whole organization, and now your primary goal is being the face of an organization and maybe fund development, right? Fundraising. And that's not at all your desire, skills, experience, like any of the things, but it now becomes the primary thing that you need to do. And I think for people that are listening, it's important to know, and I'm curious to know, Seth, from your perspective, like how important you think this is for a leader of an organization to begrudgingly accept this is part of your new normal when in
Yeah.
this role, if you want to do it really, really well. Because like most of there are some that wholeheartedly embrace this. And then there are some that like, look, we're extroverts. I like to joke from 8 to 5, and then come 5 o'clock, like nobody talked to me. No, like I don't want to be recognized. Nobody asked me. Like, it's a real struggle for a lot of people.
Sure.
But I think this is
Yeah.
one of those responsibilities that I've had to absorb within my role and as my company has evolved. That it's important for me to get comfortable with this and get comfortable being vulnerable, get comfortable, you know, building some of my personal brand, accept that that is a big part of my role is being recognizable and relatable to other people for the benefit of the business that I lead and for those that work with me. So I don't know, Seth, I'm sure you work with people like, look, Seth, I know you're supposed to help me. I know I'm supposed to do this, but like, do I really have to do this? Like, is it really that important? I'm curious from you, like, is it
Yeah.
really that important when you're a leader?
Yeah, I mean, my answer to that is absolutely, it is that
Mhm.
important. I mean, the real answer, do you have to do it? Of course, you don't have to do it,
Hmm.
but there's a lot of things that you don't have to do. But if you want to be successful, you better damn well go out and do
I
them, right?
know.
So,
Yep.
do you have to do it? Yeah. If it, I think that you would be doing a disservice to your organization if you didn't do it. Because,
Mm,
let's look at something as simple as local. We'll cross over from branding into public relations a little bit here.
hmm.
Think about your local newspaper, right? Your local
Hmm.
little weekly newspaper or whatever. The articles that they write are generally human interest driven, and they're generally about an individual.
Yeah.
They're about the success that the organization has realized in the years since executive director Jones came on board, or they're about the incredible programmatic gains that have happened since, um, you know, program director Abe came on board, or whatever the case
Hmm.
may be. They
Hmm.
journalists. I started off in journalism, and like journalists are typically not going to go out and write a story about an organization or a company because even
Mm,
if that organization or company is doing great things for people, not having like an individual or a small group of individuals to focus on is going to make the stories less engaging, less impactful, right? So they're going to
mm,
look to
mm,
have to bump up the human element of their story.
hmm.
And so as the leader of an organization, it may seem uncomfortable when it seems like the lights are turned on you and the cameras are in your face and you're saying it's
Yes.
not about me, it's about this great
Right.
organization.
Right.
But there's you can use jujitsu, right, and flip that energy around onto your
Hmm.
organization.
Yeah.
It's the same type of way that you would do it, for instance, if you were putting together a resume, right? And I'm
Hmm.
sure people can relate to this, and they fall into this trap, or they know people that have fallen into this trap, where they're trying to write their resume. This is not what I do professionally, but I've helped people before. And I'm like, well, why on here does it not say that you marketed $50 million worth of whatever? And then they say, well, I didn't market $50 million worth of whatever. I mean, the team marketed $50 million
Right.
dollars of
Right. Right.
whatever. And I say,
Hmm.
but you led the team.
Right.
So you marketed 50 million. You're not saying that you didn't have help. That doesn't say
Right.
that anywhere. And they're saying
Right.
that you marketed the $50 million, right?
Hmm.
So the flip side can be if somebody comes to you and says, you marketed $50 million worth of stuff, and you can say, yeah, I've been blessed to have this wonderful team. And if it hadn't been for them or whatever, I mean, you can take and shift that information. But if you're not out there kind of crowing about the $50 million that you raised or marketed or,
Right.
whatever the case may be, then probably you know,
No one will ever know. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the reporters aren't going to come and report on it unless
Hmm.
you're out there, uh, you know, trying to pump yourself up to a certain extent, right? Because
Yeah.
they're not coming to write a story about your team. That's just typically not the way. might happen, but it's
Right.
your chances of that happening are way, way lower than them coming to talk to a leader and talk about a leader in your organization,
Yeah.
right? So figure out how to do that. And you can see, I mean, you can do that in, right? Anytime an executive director leaves a local beloved organization, there's always going to be a profile about how
Mm,
they're leaving to go on to this greater thing. Or maybe they're
mm-hmm.
retiring, they're leaving to go spend
Mm,
more time with their family or something.
sure.
The article is clearly going to be about that person, but that doesn't mean that they can't take a lot of time talking about the wonderful things that they did while they were there. By they, meaning the organization did,
Mm-hmm.
and the other people that they worked with, and how they're so excited that the person that's stepping up to be interim executive director, if a permanent one hasn't been appointed, is going to do great things because they've been so amazing in their role of XYZ or something like that. Right. So,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, you've got to be willing to take the point because if you're not you know, some other organization is going to have a leader that's willing to do that and they're going to get all the oxygen and you're not going to
Mm-hmm.
get it.
I'm curious, you kind of mentioned like transitions. And I'm thinking about how, as a leader, you effectively like personal brand, but also knowing that the position you're in is maybe not going to be your forever home. Or you're stepping into a new organization and kind of how do you transition your personal brand when you're working for an organization? For example, I've known people that have shifted. It's all like human basic needs, and maybe that's the answer. You kind of make it a little bit more broad, but when you're somebody that's worked with early childhood education, for example, and
Mm-hmm.
then you find yourself leaving that organization and you land as a program director at a food bank, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, some would argue, like, how do you go from being passionate about children, in their early education to like food? I mean, that's kind of completely jumping ship. And so I think that's tricky too. And maybe that's holds people back from being so like open and advertising and such a strong, like vocal public advocate for the work that they're doing, especially given the turnover and the challenges in the nonprofit sector and the fact that it's like, yeah, for me, it's like I'm a CPA, I'm going to be a CPA, and like that's what I do. And until I retire, that's probably what my brand's going to be. But for someone that is all about the business of helping people, and maybe that looks differently, and maybe, I mean, like all of us, I mean, the answer is hello, we all have multiple passions. It's rarely just one
Sure.
thing, and it's okay to care about something important, like basic human needs like food. No one can really argue with that. So I think that might be a bit of a barrier for people. So any advice for those that might be a little reluctant to brand for that reason, they find themselves in transition or expecting to be in
Sure.
transition or coming into an organization that they don't have a lot of history with
Right.
public
Yeah, I
history, I guess.
right. That can certainly be difficult. I would suggest a couple of things. I mean, one, I think you I think one of the biggest ones is to just be honest about why you're making this change. I mean,
Mm,
you know, most of the reasons that people within the nonprofit sector are going to make a change from one job to another, part of that is going to be personal, right? You're
yeah,
looking for more money, you're looking
right.
for more of a leadership role or something.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
you potentially could have chosen organization X and instead you've chosen organization Y. And that deciding factor, you know, is not is not likely purely compensation package or something like
Sure,
that, right?
sure,
I
sure.
mean,
Mm-hmm.
because of the people that work in the nonprofit sector,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's probably going to be some passion reason
Right.
that played into it, at least a part, right?
Yeah.
And I would say to just be honest about that and be
Mm-hmm.
honest about why you're excited to be working for this organization. Presumably there are some leaders within that particular field that you admire. You can start off by, you don't necessarily have to talk about yourself directly. You can talk about the people that are inspiring you. You're talking about yourself because you're
Mm-hmm.
saying, I am inspired by these people and I'm
Sure.
hoping to learn from them, or, they had a big effect on me when I was
Hmm.
in college or, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
Um, I think that that's one way to go. I think another thing from a purely like storyteller standpoint that we often don't see the connections between things. Um, One, because we just plain old don't really examine it that
Kind of think
deeply,
about it.
and
Yeah.
two, we don't have the experience in doing it, right? And so I
Mm.
think I mentioned baseball at some point in this conversation. I usually do. I'm a big baseball fan, but
Hmm.
baseball players, they need a lot of time in the batting cage. They are professional. They hit pitches routinely that none of the rest of us could even hope to hit.
Right.
And yet they're
Certainly.
still in there practicing, practicing, practicing because they're, obviously they're competing at the highest level, right?
Hmm.
And so, like with anything, you might be naturally good at something, but you need to practice it. And one thing I work on with my clients is in storytelling, practicing taking what I call story seeds, story ideas, the little I was at the grocery store and this happened,
Hmm.
right? Like and seeing the connection between that and a lesson that I may want to teach something. Okay, I want you to understand that children need early childhood education or whatever, and that's
Hmm.
this story seed and this lesson. Somehow I can connect them, right?
Sure. Sure.
And sometimes the story seed is so obvious, it so obviously has to do with our early childhood education, lesson. That's
Hmm.
not a, it's not hard, but sometimes there's not an obvious connection.
Right.
Sometimes you have a story seed and you're like, wow, that's a really good story. I came home and I told it to my wife and I told it to my daughter and I told it to my friend because I just was like so inspired by it and they were all inspired by it. I'm not telling it to teach a lesson. I'm just telling an interesting story, right? So you're like, wow, I'd really like to use this. I wonder what I can use it for. Now you have to look at those story seeds and start trying to figure out, are there lessons that can be pulled from this, right? And when you start out, you might not see lessons. I can often find three, four, five different lessons that I can teach from one story, but that's because I practice it over and over and over again. And so
Hmm.
I would say, you said, okay, I'm going from early childhood education to food pantry. Those are unrelated. And I say, no, they're completely related. I mean,
Right.
because kids can't function well in school if they're not
Right.
well fed, which is why so
Right.
many schools are going to free lunches and stuff like that.
Exactly.
The
Hmm.
connections are there. I'm not, shame on you for missing this connection, obviously. But
Mm.
but the point is we sit down and think about it, the connection is there. And so that through line of you moving from job A to job B,
Hmm.
there's probably, if we examine it closely
Right.
enough, it
Exactly.
really does, it's internally consistent and it makes sense. And the
Hmm.
and the point is to play with it and figure out
Weave that
how.
together. Hmm.
Right. How do I weave that together? And so I'll just, a quick tip is that what I tell people to do is keep a story journal and, let's use it in the terms of a career, change. You
Hmm.
know that the change is coming up, your job hunting, your whatever. I mean, we start right from the very beginning. Start keeping a story journal of the things that happen to you in your life. They don't have to be the big things. They're just the stories that you tell your coworkers
Hmm.
when you get into work, when you get back from lunch, that you pick up your phone and you tell your friend about a amusing little story that came up during the day, or a frustrating story that came up in the day, right?
Hmm.
So you keep a
Right.
story journal and once a week go in and throw it into a spreadsheet and keep that spreadsheet numbered. Now have lessons that you want to teach or information that you want to convey and also keep that in a spreadsheet. So
Hmm.
why am I making this move? Was exciting to me about this new industry? What are some things
Sure.
that I learned from job A that I think will be applicable in job B? All of
Hmm.
those things go into column B. And then you have a random number generator. If you use AI, you can just ask ChatGPT or whatever, give me a number between 1 and 31 or
Yeah.
whatever it is. And then you pick your two random numbers, which gives you a story seed and a point that you're trying to make. And the practice is no matter how unrelated they are, you make them
Find a way.
relate.
I
And
love that.
sometimes you'll be surprised. You'll find a way.
Hmm.
Sometimes the connection will be so tenuous that the story you weave will be absolutely absurd. And that's sometimes fun because they're become funny stories. But the more
Hmm.
you do this, the point is that, you get done with it, you throw it away. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter. But pretty soon, if you do this week after week, you don't have to do it every day. But if every
Right.
week you practice this, pretty soon you start making those connections really quickly because you've wired your brain to look for those connections. And then it becomes a lot easier for you to generate the LinkedIn posts and the videos
Mm,
on Instagram when you're talking to people because your brain is getting those connections. You're not having to sit down at the computer and say, okay, well,
I love
what am I
that.
going to talk about, and well, how am I going to talk about it, and right.
Good tips for the creative process because sometimes of us that get in the weeds of the day to day and to sit down and do the creative work can be a trick. Seth, we're out of time though, but you promised that if people are willing to stick around to the
Yes.
end, you've got a special gift for them. So drop the nugget. What is it?
Yes. So I would love to offer up to the audience what I call the relatable story guide. And it is
Okay.
a guide about how to tell better stories, better relatable stories. And to
Mm,
get that, they can go to relatablestory.com,
okay.
and then they can put in their email and, get the PDF will be delivered to them.
Okay, relatablestory.com. We'll put that in the show notes as well for those that are interested in that. But Seth, as people were listening, if they've been hearing more about some of the stuff that we've been talking about, I know you do things beyond just like personal branding. That's just kind of been the topic of today. But if people are listening and want to either follow along with your own journey and kind of hear what you have to say, or even get in touch with you with some work that they're trying to do either personally or at an organizational level, if they need some support in kind of the marketing, communications, personal branding, what would be the best way to get in touch with you?
I would say come find me on LinkedIn, Seth Donlin.
Okay.
Um, And I live on LinkedIn. I'm there all the time, chatting in
Okay.
DMs and posting and reading other people's posts and stuff. There's always a tab open on my computer with LinkedIn on it.
Love it.
So
Love
if
it.
you DM me there, or if you don't want to talk to me right away, obviously you can just follow my content and get a sense of what I'm about. And
Exactly.
if you think that I might be able to help you, and then I'd love to hear from anybody. I'm always trying to help.
Now I'm going to be following along for your own personal branding because, like I said, this has been something that's been really interesting for me because it's certainly something that I've struggled with. And I know that I've had many conversations with other leaders that have struggled in some capacity for their own reasons for this, whether it's just they don't find the time to do it, it's not really their strength or the skill set. If you're kind of an anti-social media person like me anyway, I mean, that's a bit of a barrier. I mean, I have 10,000 excuses why sometimes I find it a barrier
Sure.
to build my own personal brand or to really embrace my role as not just like the chief CPA around here that's responsible for all the nonprofit accounting, because that's what I ultimately set out to do. Now I am somehow a brand and an image, and people
Sure.
look to me to be relatable. So this has been such an interesting conversation. Seth, I know it's probably been insightful for many people. And for those of you that are listening, go to Seth's website to get the free download. Definitely check that out. But you know what I always request if you found this conversation meaningful or impactful in any way, do what the meta world wants us to do and engage with the content in some way, whatever that might mean. Subscribe, like, share, tell your friends about it so that other nonprofit leaders like yourself can find content like this to maybe give them some tips or tricks on how to do
Mhm.
things a little bit differently so that themselves and their organizations can be more successful overall. So thank you all so much for listening, and
Yep.
I'll see you next time.
Give
Bye.
give Tasha 5 stars, folks. 5 stars.
5 stars. Thanks, guys.